Welcome to Wichita Liberty TV. This is your co-host, acting host this week. We're hoping Bob will be joining us again here soon. Bob Weeks will be joining us again here soon. I'm here with my guest, James Franco of the Kansas Policy Institute, and this show will be shown on KGPT TV at 8:30 and 4 this weekend. So, James, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be back, Carl. Wish Bob was here, but we'll make do without him.
Well, we're going to do the best we can, but we've got an awful lot of material to go over with the State of the State speech at the Kansas State House this week.
It was very interesting, and it was one way or the other was going to be Governor Brownback's parting shot, as it were, in the State of the State. But I think everyone was a little surprised when he came out and said, we need to spend $600 million more in schools.
Well, school spending has only gone in one direction in Kansas since I've been in this state, and it's always a question of not how much up is up. It's a question of what percentage up were we going to have this year, and how does that translate into dollars? Right.
So the $600 million that Governor Brownback talked about was what was effectively a mandate coming from the Kansas Supreme Court and kind of this ongoing school finance litigation. And some people don't want to call it a mandate, but if it walks like a mandate and it quacks like a mandate, then it's probably a mandate. And even Democratic legislators, attorneys and lobbyists for the schools themselves are saying you have to spend $600 million more. So on top of the over $13,600 that we're spending per pupil on average in this state, Governor Brownback's proposal was to spend an additional $600 million on top of that 13 and change. And what we're missing in all of this is that a lot of kids are falling further and further behind.
Well, the funding has nothing to do with educational achievement or performance based on the history we've had, I believe.
Well, that's certainly the case in Kansas. I mean, you can find a scholar who will tell you that there is a correlation, if not even a causation. But in Kansas, we've dumped billions of dollars more into education, K-12 education in this state, and yet the achievement gaps continue to be stubbornly persistent, if not getting bigger. And overall, most kids kind of perform decently, but not very well when you compare us across different demographic cohorts across the country, or even looking across international exams. Our achievement is very average, despite these remarkable increases in spending.
$600 million. I believe we've got somewhere around 500,000 students in Kansas public schools. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so we're talking about somewhere between $1,000 to $1,500 per pupil increase. So we're going to take that $13,000 and make it somewhere between 14 and 15. Right.
Now, Governor Brownback's budget proposal was to phase it in over a series of years, not $600 million more today, but I think his proposal was $200 million more this year than $100 over the next 4 years. And some of the other proposals that have been kicked around through the interim legislative process also suggested something of a phased-in approach, which is similar to what we saw in the mid-aughts after the Montoy decision, where we're going to spend more money over time on schools.
But aren't we in the second year of a 2-year biennial budget? So basically the real budgeting that we're doing is just for the rest of the 2018 fiscal year that began last July 1.
Right. But then, to my mind, the interesting thing is not necessarily, is this the right number? Because I don't think anybody's ever really come up with the right number. The cost study that a lot of these judicial decisions are based on, even the people who did the study themselves, Augenblick and Myers, said that these were more akin to estimates rather than being proof positive as far as saying this is the dollar amount you need to spend.
But the Augenblick and Myers study, that was over a decade ago.
Right.
We're talking ancient history and public policy terms.
But it still continues to come up. It's like that sock in the laundry, right, that you just can't seem to get rid of. It's just, it always comes up as this is what we did and this is the number that we need to spend. And if the legislature came up with that number on their own, anybody may disagree with it or agree with it, or if the State Board of Education was involved in this process as well. To my mind, the interesting question is that this Kansas Supreme Court is effectively operating as the Education Committee, and more importantly, as the Appropriations and Tax Committees, to where they are the ones who are effectively setting what are fundamentally kind of political policy questions, not questions of actual constitutional muster.
But we've got an appointed judiciary The governor selects, after a committee recommends, 3 names to him, the members of the court, and they stand for retention elections every 6 years. However, we've never had any member of the appellate courts rejected in any of the referendum for over half a century we've been doing this. So we've got an appointed branch of judicial oligarchy, in effect, kind of driving state policy. And in a democratic republic, that seems kind of odd to me. What do you think?
I mean, there's lots of different states that have different models for how they appoint their Supreme Court justices or whatnot. But there was a case recently out of Texas where it was a similar constitutional question of should you fund education at a certain level or should you not? And their Supreme Court, for all intents and purposes, said this is a decision best arrived at by the people's elected representatives, by the legislature. And that's how that now will proceed in Texas. Whereas in Kansas, very clearly we have a court that some would label as activist. At the very least, they have robust opinions that they don't mind sharing with the legislature to say, you shall spend X. Now, again, it may not be a mandate. They didn't write a specific dollar amount in.
Well, in this decision, they have in the past.
They have in the past. But in this decision, they said, you need more new money, and they put that new money in quotes, and they said, okay, well, it could be $600 million. That's what the State Board of Education suggested. Or it could be upwards of close to $1.5 billion, because that's what the plaintiff's attorneys suggested. Now, we're not giving you a number, but here's your range. Go forth, legislature, and respond. So again, if it walks like a mandate and it quacks like a mandate, that sounds an awful lot like a judicial mandate to my ears.
Well, we're going to have to take a break here, and we will be right back to continue discussing the state of the state here in Kansas in 2018 on Wichita Liberty TV. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. This is your co-host, Karl Peterjohn, sitting in for regular host, Bob Weeks. Our guest this week is James Franco, Vice President of the Kansas Policy Institute. James, we were talking a little bit about the state of the state in terms of Kansas, but the Kansas Policy Institute has actually provided some valuable public service in terms of a poll of Kansans concerning major state issues. Would you talk for a minute, because in our first segment we talked a little bit about the court mandate on school finance and driving the Kansas budget. What do the people think?
I think
based on the poll,
3 fundamental things. When we polled folks in the middle of November, 512 registered voters in Kansas using the same outlet that the Wichita Eagle, KCTV5 up in Kansas City have used, so a reputable polling firm, Survey USA, is that a couple of things jump out. One, 82% of Kansans want to see schools stay open amidst all this legislative and legal wrangling. 73% don't want higher income taxes to pay for the school finance mandate, as we were talking about, coming from the court. And maybe most interestingly, that gets to the heart of this issue, is that 6 in 10 Kansans want to change the Constitution so that the judicial branch of government is no longer interfering with the education of kids and teachers and families. And I think it's time, since the 1960s, when we adopted the Constitution that we have now, that maybe it's time to do something a little bit different and let the voice of the people be heard when it comes to how our kids are educated and how much money we spend to educate them.
But 60% of the public may not necessarily translate into 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House that you need to pass a constitutional amendment to get to the issue, a constitutional amendment, onto the state ballot.
Certainly not. And there was, even amongst that 60%, 21% of folks wanted it to be change the Constitution so that clearly the legislative branch was in charge. 38% wanted something of a rules-based approach to where suitable funding shall be defined as X percent of, call it state budget or personal income or gross state product or something like that. So there's even some uncertainty as to what that amendment would look like. But I think it's hard for you or me or one of the legislators up in Topeka or Governor Brownback or Lieutenant Governor Collier at some point
Or soon to be maybe Governor
Collier, is to say that Kansans don't want something to happen differently. What they know is that we've spent more and more and more money, record levels of taxpayer support on education, staggering achievement gaps between high-income kids and low-income kids, and that we have these judges who are interfering with the most basic relationship that exists in the classroom, which is between a teacher and a student. And as long as there's attorneys and lobbyists and all these people interfering with that relationship, it's going to be the kids who are going to be left behind.
Well, that goes to an interesting point, James, where you're looking at the political process, the lobbyists, the elected officials, the judges, right, driving this issue out of the State House, and not the students, not the teachers, not the parents. And this seems to be, this doesn't seem to be a recipe for success. And from where I'm sitting, are there any bright spots that are being to get us out of this? And what are other states in the country doing that are having more success than Kansas in improving student achievement?
Well, I think there's a lot of talk about the need to change the Kansas Constitution. Regardless of where we find ourselves today with Gannon, are we just going to be back here in the same spot?
Okay, when you said Gannon, that's the court case, that's the lawsuit.
Yes, excuse me. So that's the current lawsuit, right, is Gannon v. State of Kansas. And before that it was Montoy, before that it was USD 229, dating back to the Clinton administration, that we've been in this constant litigation. So I think there's a genuine belief that we need to change the Constitution so that regardless of what happens with the current court case, we're setting the table so that we're not back here in another 10 years. But then also at things like holding schools accountable for outcomes, giving kids and families the opportunity to pursue their education in a private setting via a tax credit or an education savings account, robust charter schools, these things that put families back in charge of their individual kids' education. Because in what endeavor of life anymore do we expect one system, as you said, to serve 500,000 kids equally well? And the answer is we don't. This is the one place in our life where we don't really have that choice, and it's the most fundamental. It's how do we educate our kids?
Well, when we're looking at a process that covers, 13 years and that are just hugely formative, but if we're in a situation, James, where we need to look at this in the total budget picture for state spending, and we'll do that after we take a break. For Wichita Liberty TV, this is Karl Peterjohn. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. This is your co-host, acting host, Karl Peterjohn, sitting here with James Franco of the Kansas Public Policy Institute, talking about the state of Kansas. And one of the important aspects of the state, James, is our income tax. Now, the poll we talked about that KPI, Kansas Policy Institute, recently did occurred before the latest income tax increase. The massive increase in income taxes that was approved by the 2017 legislature had two phases. Part of it, the increase occurred July 1, part of it took effect January 1, which is, the poll was in between those two.
Right.
Let's talk for a minute. $600 million, I've heard some criticism of Governor Brownback's proposed spending increase because he doesn't have a specific resource. He doesn't propose raising taxes again. Let's go through, what did your poll look at in terms of, what was the response in terms of raising taxes in your poll?
Right, so we did the poll in the middle of November of 2017, and what we tested, as it were, was how did Kansans view the tax impact of funding that $600 million through a variety of different taxes. So for something like income tax, that results in a 20% surcharge on our state income taxes as individuals. And 73% of Kansans said, no, don't raise my income taxes any further. This is, as you pointed out, in addition to the big retroactive tax hike that the 2017 legislature passed as well. Property taxes, 57% said they didn't want to pay higher property taxes. And what that works out to, when you look at that $600 million, is roughly a doubling of the state school property tax levy in the state. So we double that 57% of people didn't want that to happen, and then folks also didn't want to see the highest sales tax in the state, in the country, which is what it would take to fund it through sales taxes. So, to a certain extent, it's kind of like a balloon, right? Whether the tax increase itself is a variety of different taxes or other fees or what have you, or if it's all in income or property or sales, the point is, Kansans are going to have to reach deeper into their pockets to send more money to Topeka to fund an education system that's being dictated by a bunch of judges in the Kansas Supreme Court. And clearly, Kansas voters don't want to see that happen.
Well, but the court isn't saying how much to raise taxes. In fact, the litigants aren't saying how to raise taxes either. Of course, they're speaking on behalf of the school districts that are funding the lawsuit, which I feel very uncomfortable with the idea of tax dollars being used to sue to increase tax dollars. But this seems to be part of making Kansas a high tax point on the prairie, and I would be interested in terms of Kansas Policy Institute's take on, does this put us in a unique position to have this sort of environment in place?
Well, I think it is unique, certainly, in that we have this judicial branch that's acting as almost as a appropriations and tax committee. And from our perspective, this is why it's important for these questions to be dictated by the legislative branch, where they're trying to balance all of these different needs. Yes, education, which is fundamental to what every state does, but also what's the tax policy, and not just what the taxes are, but how does that equate with, as you pointed out, being the high tax location in the prairie, and what does that do for economic growth? And all of the other government services that are at play here. We could fund this $600 million by slashing across the board state government spending 18%. Now, that means prisons, Department of Children and Families,
public safety, highway patrol,
all of these other things are going to get an 18% cut.
Okay.
Potentially, if we just funded it all through budget cuts, so that we could fund more for schools. And in this regard, this is where the people's elected representatives are the ones who are best equipped to handle these things, is to weigh these different priorities, weigh them against economic growth and tax policy and all of these different things, because these are all important functions of state government.
Well, we could be in a situation where, in terms of state general fund spending, if we do the increase in the $600 million that Governor Brownback has proposed, aren't we spending somewhere around 2/3 of the total state general fund budget on education spending? Now, that includes colleges too, but it's
right.
K-12 plus higher ed.
Right, K-12 always bounces around 50%, and higher ed is another, 12, 13, 14%, so roughly the 2/3 that you were discussing. It changes in any given year. But that's a lot of money going to, as you pointed out, education, compared to all of the other functions of government, keeping people safe, keeping roads paved, all of those different types of functions.
Well, we're wrapping up this segment, and we're going to talk a little bit about other state issues besides taxes and school finance when we come back. This is Karl Peterjohn for Wichita Liberty TV. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. This is your co-host, guest host, Karl Peterjohn, here with James Franco of the Kansas Public Policy Institute. We spent a lot of time talking about taxes and school finance. Let's talk about other major issues up in Topeka. What's the other big issue facing the 2018 Kansas legislature?
Well, the one thing that continues to be and has been an issue for years now is whether or not Kansas will expand Medicaid to able-bodied working-age adults as part of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. It depends on how you want to describe that.
We'll call it Obamacare.
Fair enough. Well, there's plenty of things. I mean, even President Obama at one point said that he welcomed the mantle of Obamacare. So let's call it Obamacare. So it's the idea that we would extend Medicaid benefits to able-bodied working-aged adults, which means people who are otherwise healthy and capable of working. These are not people who are disabled, and that we would bring them into the Medicaid rolls. And even the Kansas Health Institute, which is nobody's conservative organization, said that the cost over a decade, the first decade of that program, would be over $1 billion, which may not sound like a lot of money, but within a state like Kansas, that's real money that is being used outside of other core government functions to essentially fund this mandate to expand Obamacare. And really quickly, that also assumes that the federal government is going to honor their promises, which even the Obama administration said they will not be able to do the price match that was embedded in the original Obamacare. The federal government's broke, and they don't have the money to honor that promise. So they've already talked about, even at the end of the Obama administration, walking the federal dollars down.
And there were costs that the state had to pick up, even with the 100% federal match that they initially received.
Right. So that estimate from the Kansas Health Institute suggests that it's only going to get bigger as the federal government moves towards a more traditional blended rate on Medicaid matching dollars. Never mind that the enrollment and the cost figures in other states that have expanded Medicaid as part of Obamacare have absolutely blown through any estimates. And the number is just staggering. And more importantly, again, we were talking about education earlier, and the outcomes for that money is Medicaid doesn't necessarily lead to better health outcomes.
Well, the interesting thing, I've looked at it from the financial end, is roughly 3/5 of the states have gone with the Obamacare Medicaid expansion, and 2/5 have not. Kansas is part of that 2/5, 19 states, I believe. Doesn't that give us a leg up in terms of comparative advantage compared to those states that have tied themselves down to this massive increase in spending and put themselves, they're at a comparative disadvantage if they did the expansion?
Well, and the other issue here is that we're talking about this expansion at a time when, whether it happens or not, nobody knows. Nobody knows what's going to happen in Washington, D.C. these days, or any other day for that matter. But Congress is actively talking about changing the program pretty fundamentally, or even outright repealing the Affordable Care Act. So why would Kansas legislators, at a time with that much uncertainty, both legislatively, budgetarily at the federal level, why would they put us in to a program that locks us into these mandates going forward and arguably into perpetuity, if not anything approaching the foreseeable or long-term future? And it just doesn't seem responsible to me to put taxpayers on the hook for those types of things with that much uncertainty facing the program.
Well, the Kansas Policy Institute's done a great job with this poll of outlining kind of where the public policy, where the public is at this point. But we've got over a dozen candidates for governor, and the three major issues in terms of Medicaid expansion, school finance, and who's going to make the decisions on school finance and taxes going forward. So you're looking at some real challenges legislatively. I'm curious in terms of, as we wrap up here, if you have any closing thoughts with the ability of the legal system to be able to drive through the courts Kansas government.
Well, I think the dynamic that we have in Kansas is very interesting in how the different branches of government interact with each other. Yes, the courts, of course, and how, as I've said before, kind of operate as this tax and appropriations committee as it relates to education. But then we have a fourth branch of government with the State Board of Education that is responsible for, effectively the policy of public education, whereas the legislature is responsible for financing the educational interests of the state. So it makes for a very interesting mix. And at least as it relates to education, it hasn't lent itself to good outcomes for Kansas kids, referencing those achievement gaps and some of the stagnating overall achievement that we've seen in the past as well.
Well, you mentioned the critical word in terms of suitable interests for the state, as opposed to people who said, well, this means a suitable education, or it means an adequate or equitable education. Those aren't the words in the Kansas Constitution, but it seems to be part of the edicts coming down from our judicial branch in Topeka. James, appreciate you coming in, and
thank you very
thanks
much
for an outline.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for watching Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be back next week. Thanks.